December 20th, 1987, 10:30 p.m., the Tablas Strait, Philippines. Most of the 4,000 people on board the MV Doña Paz were asleep. It was 5 days before Christmas. The ferry was making a standard run from Tacloban to Manila, carrying people home for the holiday. Below decks, families had settled for the overnight crossing. Children were asleep. The crossing was routine. The Tablas Strait was not considered a dangerous passage. At 10:30 p.m., the Doña Paz struck the MT Vector, an oil tanker carrying 8,800 barrels of petroleum products. The Vector's cargo ignited on contact. The fire spread to the Doña Paz in minutes. Both ships were engulfed. 4,300 people died. No distress signal was ever received by the Philippine Coast Guard. No rescue began for approximately 9 hours, when survivors were found floating in the strait. The water temperature on the Tablas Strait is approximately 28 degrees Celsius, warm enough to survive in for many hours. The sharks are not. 24 people survived. 2 of them were from the Vector. The Titanic killed 1,517 people and has been the subject of countless books, films, documentaries, exhibitions, and museum installations. The Doña Paz killed 4,300 people and has a Wikipedia page. The difference between those two outcomes is not a difference in tragedy. It is a difference in whose tragedy the world decided to pay attention to. Here is what the official numbers look like. The Philippine government's final official death toll for the Doña Paz disaster is 1,749 people. This number is a fiction. It is derived from the Doña Paz's official passenger manifest for that voyage. The manifest listed 1,583 ticketed passengers and 166 crew, for a total of 1,749 people. The actual number of people on board was somewhere between 3,800 and 4,386. It was 5 days before Christmas. The Doña Paz was one of the primary passenger routes between the Visayas and Manila. People were desperate to get home for the holiday. The ship's capacity was 1,512. Its manifest listed 1,583 ticketed passengers. But hundreds of additional passengers had made informal arrangements with members of the crew, paying cash, boarding without tickets, settling in passageways and open deck spaces not counted in any official capacity calculation. This was not unusual. On major Philippine ferry routes in the 1980s, overloading was not an exception to normal operations. It was normal operations. The Doña Paz had a documented history of carrying substantially more passengers than its official capacity. The company operating at Sulpicio Lines had a documented history of operating overloaded vessels. Neither the company nor the regulators who should have been enforcing capacity limits had found a way to make compliance happen. The real death toll, between 3,800 and 4,386, makes the Doña Paz disaster not merely the worst peacetime maritime disaster since the Titanic. It makes it the worst peacetime maritime disaster in history by a significant margin. The world has chosen largely not to remember it. 3 facts about the Doña Paz disaster that define what it means when no one is held to account. The first, the MT Vector, the oil tanker that struck the Doña Paz, was operating that night with no lookout posted on deck. The individual responsible for watching for other vessels, the person whose entire job was to prevent the kind of collision that killed 4,000 people, was not at their station. The Vector's master held only a coastwise license, which authorized operation only in sheltered coastal waters, not the open Tablas Strait. The Vector was in the wrong waters with an underqualified master and no lookout. This was documented in the post-accident investigation. The second, no distress signal was transmitted by either ship after the collision. This is not because the radios were destroyed in the initial impact. Survivors from the Vector later testified that the communications equipment was functional in the minutes after the collision. No call was made. The fire spread too quickly. Both vessels were engulfed within minutes of the initial ignition, before anyone in a position to transmit had the time or the decision-making clarity to do so. The Philippine Coast Guard received no distress call on the night of December 20. They learned about the disaster when survivors were spotted floating in the strait by a passing vessel approximately 9 hours later. The third Sulpicio Lines, the company operating the Doña Paz, had been involved in 3 previous serious maritime accidents in the decade before 1987. The MV Doña Florentina ran aground in 1981. The MV Don Juan collided with an oil tanker in 1980, killing over 1,000 people in what was, at the time, the worst peacetime maritime disaster in Philippine history. The company continued operating. The same company that lost the Don Juan in 1980, with over 1,000 casualties, was still operating major passenger ferry routes in 1987. Regulatory action sufficient to prevent a repeat did not occur. 7 years later, the Doña Paz, the Philippine inter-island shipping industry in the 1980s, was the essential transportation infrastructure of an archipelago nation. The Philippines consists of over 7,000 islands. For the majority of Filipinos who did not have access to air travel, inter-island ferries were the only way to move between islands, to reach Manila for work, to return home to the provinces for holidays, to transport goods and cargo. The ferry network was massive, diverse, and largely unregulated in any meaningful sense. The vessels operating on major routes like Tacloban-Manila were typically older ships, often purchased second-hand from foreign operators and reflagged under Philippine registry. Maintenance standards were inconsistent. Crew certification requirements existed on paper, but enforcement was irregular. Capacity limits existed in the regulations, but were routinely exceeded without consequence. The combination of high demand, low regulatory enforcement, and competitive commercial pressure created an environment in which safety compliance was treated as optional. The MV Doña Paz had entered service in 1963, originally built in Japan as the Hime Yurimaru. By 1987, she was 24 years old. She was operated by Sulpicio Lines, one of the larger inter-island ferry operators in the Philippines, headquartered in Cebu City. Her passenger capacity was certified at 1,512 people. She was regularly operated with substantially more than that number on board. On December 20th, 1987, the Doña Paz departed Tacloban on the island of Leyte in the early morning hours, bound for Manila via an intermediate stop in Catbalogan. She was carrying the officially listed 1,583 ticketed passengers, plus 166 crew, already slightly over her certified capacity. She was also carrying an unknown number of additional passengers who had boarded informally, paying passage fees directly to crew members and settling in spaces not reflected on any manifest. Filipino Christmas is the most significant holiday season in Philippine culture, the period when millions of people who have migrated to Manila and other urban centers for work return to their provincial home provinces for extended family gatherings. The days immediately before Christmas are the peak travel period of the year. Ferries on major routes are routinely packed beyond capacity in this period. December 20th, 1987 was 5 days before Christmas. The MT Vector was a smaller vessel, an oil tanker operated by the Tacloban Socor Caltex shipping group, carrying approximately 8,800 barrels of petroleum products, including gasoline and industrial fuel oil. She had departed from Bataan on the Luzon side of the strait and was bound for ports in the Visayas. The Tabla Strait is approximately 30 kilometers wide at the crossing point and is one of the busier shipping lanes in the Philippine archipelago, regularly used by inter-island vessels of all sizes. Navigation in the strait requires attention, but it is not inherently dangerous under normal conditions with competent watchkeeping. The Vector's masters, established by the subsequent investigation, held a license that authorized him to operate only in protected coastal waters. The Tabla Strait is classified as open water. He was legally unauthorized to be there. Whether this was known to the operating company and overlooked, or genuinely unknown, was not definitively established in the investigation. On deck, in the hours before the collision, the Vector had no lookout posted. Whether the crew member who should have been watching for other vessels was below decks, or asleep, or otherwise absent from their station, was not determined. What is established is that no alarm was raised on the Vector before impact, that no one on board that ship saw the Doña Paz approaching in time to take avoiding action. The Doña Paz, for its part, was operating in the standard way, proceeding at normal speed through the strait on a route that had been run hundreds of times. Whether the Doña Paz's watch was also inattentive, or whether the Vector appeared so suddenly and at such close range that there was no time to maneuver, was not determined to the satisfaction of investigators. What is clear is that neither ship took evasive action before the collision. The Vector struck the Doña Paz at approximately 10:30 p.m. The impact was not by itself catastrophic. Ships have collided in these waters, and both survived. What determined the outcome on December 20th, 1987, was the 8,800 barrels of petroleum products in the Vector's hold. The ignition was nearly instantaneous. The exact ignition source was never definitively identified. The collision damage, the spilled fuel, the electrical systems of one or both ships, or possibly an open flame somewhere on deck. What the investigation established was that within minutes of impact, both vessels were burning, and that the fire on the Doña Paz had spread to the interior of the ship where the passengers were. Below decks, in the darkness, in a ship on fire, with 4,000 people packed into a vessel, certified for 1,500, the evacuation that needed to happen could not. The passageways were too crowded. The life preservers were insufficient in number for the actual number of people on board. Many passengers had no idea where the lifeboats were. The fire moved faster than the evacuation. The Doña Paz sank within approximately 2 hours of the collision. The Vector sank as well. The Tabla Strait was, by the early hours of December 21st, 1987, a debris field across a wide area. Life preservers, wooden planking, personal belongings, and the survivors who had managed to get off the ship before it went under. The survivors clung to whatever was floating. The water was warm. The sharks were not sleeping. 9 hours passed before a passing vessel spotted them and raised the alarm. By the time Philippine Coast Guard rescue ships arrived, the survivors who had lasted through the night were 24 people. 24 out of more than 4,000. The Philippine government's accident investigation was hampered by several factors. The manifests were incomplete. Many of the informally boarded passengers had no documentation. The survivors were few, and their accounts, while consistent in the basic outline, varied in details about the minutes after the collision. The physical evidence, both ships were on the bottom of the Tabla Strait, was largely inaccessible. The legal proceedings that followed established the basic facts of the Vector's operational deficiencies: the unlicensed master, the absent lookout. Civil compensation cases were filed by survivors and families of victims. Sulpicio Lines disputed the claim that the Doña Paz had been overloaded, maintaining that the ship had been carrying only the passengers on the official manifest. This position was difficult to sustain, given the survivor accounts, which consistently described conditions far more crowded than a 1,583 passenger load on a 1,512 capacity ship would produce. The accounts described passageways so packed that movement was almost impossible. People sleeping on open decks, families settled in stairwells. These descriptions were consistent with a passenger load of 3 to 4 times the official capacity, not slightly over. Sulpicio lines continued to operate after the Doña Paz disaster. They paid compensation to some families. They were not shut down. Their operating licenses were not permanently revoked. In 2008, another Sulpicio Lines vessel, the MV Princess of the Stars, was sunk by Typhoon Frank while the company had been advised by the Philippine government not to allow its vessels to depart from port. 844 people died. The company was subsequently ordered to suspend operations. The order was eventually lifted. The 1987 disaster and its victims were, in practical terms, absorbed into the background of Philippine maritime accident statistics. The country has a long history of maritime disasters, driven by the same combination of factors that produced the Doña Paz: high demand, inadequate regulation, commercial pressure, and a regulatory environment in which the costs of compliance consistently appeared higher than the costs of non-compliance until a catastrophe made the calculation visible. The Doña Paz is not forgotten in the Philippines. In the communities that lost people, in Leyte, in Samar, in the provinces where the passengers came from, December 20 is still a date of private grief. The families who lost members still know the story. Advocates for maritime safety reform have cited it for decades. It is forgotten in the world's broader collective memory of maritime disasters. The Titanic's victims were largely white, largely Western, largely middle class or wealthy, on a crossing that was covered by international media from the moment the distress calls were received. The Doña Paz's victims were Filipino, poor or working class, on a domestic holiday crossing that no international media outlet was covering. When it sank, the world's newspapers found space for a paragraph or two. The story did not generate films. It did not generate an industry of memory. 4,300 people, the largest peacetime maritime disaster in history, and 24 survivors. The 24 survivors of the Doña Paz disaster gave accounts that were consistent in their description of the conditions on board in the hours before the collision. The ship was extremely crowded. Passageways between decks were packed. The main passenger areas on the lower decks, where most of the people were settled, were standing room only in the corridors, with sleeping spaces claimed in any available flat area. The conditions were not unusual by the standards of peak holiday inter-island ferry travel in the Philippines in the 1980s. They were normal. The survivors who made it off the ship were, in almost all cases, people who were either on upper decks or near exits at the moment of impact and fire. The below-deck passengers, the majority, had almost no chance once the fire spread. The timeline from collision to engulfment of the lower decks was measured in minutes, not the hours that a proper evacuation would have required. The lifeboats that existed were not deployed in any organized way. The personal flotation devices available, and there were not enough for the actual number of people on board, were distributed in the chaos in whatever way individuals could manage. The survivors spent between 9 and 12 hours in the Tablas Strait before being found. The accounts they gave of that period are difficult to read. The sharks that inhabit the Tablas Strait are real and numerous. The personal flotation available to each survivor varied. Some had proper life jackets. Others were clinging to planking or cargo containers. Several survivors reported seeing people who were alive when they entered the water die during the night from shark attack, from exhaustion, from swallowing fuel oil, from the psychological collapse that can overtake a person who has watched everything around them end. Christopher Caboag, one of the survivors, was a 16-year-old traveling home from Manila for the Christmas holiday. His account, given to investigators and later to journalists, describes finding a piece of floating wood in the darkness after the ship went down and holding on to it through the night. He described hearing people around him in the water and then not hearing them. He described the sharks. He was found by a passing vessel in the morning, alone on his piece of wood, one of 24. The operator of the passing vessel that found the survivors, the MV Don Claudio, immediately radioed the Philippine Coast Guard with the survivor locations and descriptions of the debris field. This was the first official notification of the disaster approximately 9 hours after it occurred. The Coast Guard response was rapid once the notification was received. The problem was not the response to notification. The problem was the 9-hour gap during which no notification existed. In the days after the disaster became known, the Philippine government's attention turned to the question of how many people had actually been on board. Sulpicio Lines maintained the official manifest figure of 1,749. Survivors described conditions inconsistent with that number. Families who had received no communication from relatives who had been on the ship, relatives whose names appeared on no manifest, began registering missing persons reports. Those reports accumulated into a number far larger than 1,749. The investigative commission appointed by the Philippine government estimated the true passenger count at between 3,000 and 4,386. The methodology for this estimate was never entirely transparent, and the wide range of the estimate reflects the fundamental impossibility of counting people who left no documentary trace of their presence. The families of informally boarded passengers had no manifest entry to point to. They had only the knowledge that their family member had been on that ship, that the ship had sunk, and that their family member had not come home. The Philippine government eventually adopted a working figure of approximately 4,000 total passengers and crew as the basis for compensation calculations. The official death toll in government records remains 1,749 because those are the only deaths that can be documented through the passenger manifest. The gap between 1,749 and 4,000 represents people who, in the official record, do not appear to have existed. Sulpicio Lines, in the legal proceedings that followed, faced civil claims from families of victims. The company disputed the overloading claims and contested the higher passenger estimates. The legal process was protracted. Compensation was eventually paid to some families with amounts that varied significantly based on the legal documentation each family could produce. Families of informally boarded passengers with no manifest entry faced the greatest difficulty establishing their claims. The regulatory failures that allowed the conditions for the Doña Paz disaster to exist, the pattern of overloading, the inadequate certification standards for masters and crew, the absence of effective enforcement, were addressed in the years after the disaster through a combination of regulatory reforms and international maritime safety standards applied to Philippine-flagged vessels. Whether those reforms were sufficient, and whether the pattern of risk normalization that produced the Doña Paz had been genuinely addressed was tested again in 2008 when the MV Princess of the Stars departed in the face of a typhoon warning and sank with 844 additional lives lost. The company that operated both ships was Sulpicio Lines. The 1,917 people who died in the Vajont Valley in Italy in 1963 have a monument in the rebuilt Longarone. The 1,517 people who died on the Titanic have a museum in Belfast, exhibitions in multiple countries, and an annual commemorative event on the anniversary of the sinking. The 4,300 people who died in the Tablas Strait on December 20, 1987, have a small marker at a port in the Philippines and an entry in the accident statistics of the International Maritime Organization. The differences in how societies memorialize disasters tell you with considerable precision which lives those societies considered worth remembering. The question Doña Paz raises is not a complicated one. It only feels complicated because the answer is uncomfortable. If you want to understand which disasters the world decides to remember and which ones it decides to forget, and what that decision reveals about us, subscribe. Every week, a story that was hidden in